Is it ethical to display human corpses in public? For many of us, our exposure to the deceased human body occurs during funerals or celebrations of life events. For others, they may be involved with the dissection of human cadavers for the teaching of anatomy as medical practitioners. Other times, biomedical scientists may use cadavers or human specimens for research and study. But when is it appropriate to use human remains for public displays for educational or entertainment purposes? Who speaks for the ancient dead that have not consented for their mummified remains to be put on display? I'm John Hoffman, and this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science is Exposed. When is it appropriate to display human bodies in public or in private? I choose the topics for these ethical dilemmas in science based on current events so that we can examine the science and the associated ethical concerns. This week, the idea came from the Body Worlds exhibit at the Allentown Da Vinci Science Center. Now, in the Body Worlds exhibit, we have donated bodies, bodies that have of individuals that have given consent for their bodies to be, in essence, dissected and preserved to be put on display for educational purposes. And so what we have, and as illustrated on this slide, are different bodies that have been dissected in a variety of ways and then preserved through the process of plastination. Now, this is a process invented by Dr. Gunther von Hagens, a German anatomist, where they basically replace the fluids in the body with plastics that eventually harden. And so what you end up with is a solid, odorless, and very durable anatomical specimen. And so what we're looking at are going to be different examples of very well dissected, very well preserved human bodies that are now on display. For many of us, our exposure to a deceased human body is going to be associated with an open casket viewing as part of a funeral or a celebration of life type event. In this case, the body is often going to be embalmed to slow down the decay process to allow for the open casket viewing to occur. Ultimately, the body will be placed within the coffin and buried where the normal kind of decomposition of the body is going to occur over a period of time. In some circumstances, the use of the human body goes beyond the funeral and celebration of life. Instead, it may be donated to science or used in science for the teaching of clinicians. Now, in this painting by Rembrandt in 1632, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, we're looking at an anatomy lesson in which the official Amsterdam city anatomist was allowed to have one public dissection per year, normally with the body of an executed criminal. Now, these anatomy lessons were important for the training of doctors, but they were also public events, social events, in which students and the public were allowed to attend by paying an entrance fee in order to be able to study more and learn more about the body. Today, the use of cadavers for the study of anatomy is often relegated to only those training in clinical fields. And so for the training of doctors and nurses, physical therapists, physician assistants, and others within clinical fields, study the human body. In general, we don't see the opportunity for members of the public to view an autopsy as a social event or any other event as was occurring within the past. Now, in December 2022, in an article within Independent in Great Britain, there was an announcement that their Channel 4 was going to air the dissection of a woman who died from a rare form of cancer. Now, this is essentially the first public dissection of a human body in almost 200 years within Great Britain. Now, in this case, the woman that died of a rare form of cancer had agreed to donate her body for science, for research, as well as education. And in this documentary showing the dissection of her body, it's actually narrated by her using audio clips that she recorded ahead of time, interviews with her family, as well as what it seems to be an artificial intelligence training of her voice to provide additional narrative to that autopsy. Now, there are other examples of human remains put on display. A good example of this is the Irish giant Charles Byrne, who was 7 foot 7 inches tall, and that was a result of a benign tumor in his pituitary gland that resulted in kind of a growth abnormality. Now, even though he had toured throughout Great Britain, presenting himself as a human curiosity to basically earn a living, he did not want his body to be dissected or studied in any way. And he had asked his friends and colleagues to be buried at sea. Ultimately, anatomist John Hunter paid for someone to remove his body from the coffin, and then John Hunter displayed the skeleton in his London home turd museum for a number of years, and ultimately the skeleton ended up in the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. Now, looking at the use of his body for research, in the 2000s, an endocrinologist isolated DNA from one of the teeth and was able to identify a genetic mutation for this unchecked, uncontrolled growth, and then tied this to a number of families within Ireland, including descendants of Charles Byrne, the original Irish giant. Now, as part of a renovation of the Hunterian Museum, basically the skeleton was taken off of display, and during that time there was a decision to remove it from public display, but to maintain it for bona fide research needs. Now, any discussion of human remains on public display have to consider the Egyptian mummified remains that are commonly and colloquially known as mummies. Now, what we have with that mummification process is a way of preserving the body by deliberately drying and embalming the flesh. And in doing so, they have preserved the body in a way that is kind of similar to the Body Worlds exhibits that started out with this talk. Now, for some people, they argue that the people that are represented by these mummies, the people that were alive and they're upon death, preserved as these mummified remains, never consented to have their bodies put on public display. Others have argued that ancient Egyptians, as part of this mummification process, sought immortality, and so this public display allows them an interaction with the living. And so this gives a question, what is the difference between a tomb surrounded by artifacts, maybe within the pyramids, maybe within just a tomb, kind of within a rock carving out in the Egyptian desert. What is the difference between that and the body being on display with artifacts, artwork, and riches within a museum? Whose voice counts in providing consent for this display? Is it the perceived wishes of the ancient Egyptians? Should it be the views of modern Egyptians, the descendants of those individuals that we are now displaying in publics? Or should it be in the purview of scientists and scholars? Now, while the discussion of Egyptian mummified remains is global, it's worldwide, we have an issue closer to home. It's estimated that over 110,000 Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Alaska Natives ancestors are being held within museums, universities, or federal agencies. Now, in many cases, these ancient remains were collected for a variety of reasons, but they were often used to study the Native Americans, the indigenous people, in an effort to delineate or define their differences between the white European population. Now, as part of the 1906 Antiquities Act, it permitted the collection on federal land for the benefit of reputable museums for permanent display. and they argued that the skeletal remains and objects of these indigenous people had scholarly value. More recently, in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, basically required that those institutions that house human remains and funerary objects should be consulting with Native American groups and providing inventory by 1995, and it established criteria for these indigenous populations to reclaim the remains of their ancestors, sacred objects, and cultural items. Now, this has been a program that has never been funded, and the progress has been incredibly slow. In many cases, the remains have been labeled as culturally identifiable because the objects come kind of before European contact, so before 1673. And because of that, there are no reliable written records. And so it's difficult to determine who is the descendants, who are these ancestors representing in the modern day world. And so because of that, now multiple tribes within a region are collectively claiming cultural affiliation in an effort to reclaim these bodies and place them, return them to the burial grounds where they can be basically resting in peace. Now, some scientists have argued against the repatriation, saying that basically returning these objects will limit the opportunity for future research on American Indian prehistory. Now, returning back to this concept that deceased bodies, these corpses, these cadavers, could be used for research and anatomical study, we recognize that historically it was difficult to receive these bodies. It was difficult to obtain the bodies with consent. And so many training physicians, many anatomists, basically paid for individuals to obtain recently deceased corpses and provide them for anatomical dissection and study, contributing to the concept of grave robbers. And then in this etching from 1773 by Austin shows William Hunter, that anatomist that we talked about in terms of the Irish giant, running away as the town watch comes in and in an effort to prevent the grave robbery from occurring, kind of chasing them off from the cemetery. Now, at this point, maybe in the 1800s, we start to see the laws being put in place that sadly basically said that medical schools could obtain unclaimed bodies from hospitals and poorhouses, resulting in the poor, the vulnerable, the indigent being used for these anatomical dissections in a way that was not occurring with those of a more affluent ability for the resources to basically protect their bodies going into the afterlife. Now, to tie these concepts of the use of human cadavers, deceased human remains, and tie it in a little bit to some of the concepts we've talked about already with ethical systems, Jeremy Bentham was an 18th century British philosopher and is recognized as the pioneer of utilitarianism. So even though John Stuart Mills is often studied in aspects of utilitarianism, Bentham was the person that came up with the original ideas, was the original proponent. And he wanted his body to have purpose after death. He wanted to be used after his death. And so he's reported to be the first person that actually donated their body to science when he died in 1832. Now, he requested that his body be dissected for the aid and scientific study and research, and then he also asked that his skeleton and head be preserved. Ultimately, his skeleton was padded with hay, and he was dressed in his own clothes. So his skeleton surrounded by hay is represented by what's referred to as an auto icon, with his hat, with his walking stick, and his chair. And in this way, he was able to attend meetings with his disciples at the University College of London, where he was a founder. Now, what's interesting is 180 plus years after his death, Bentham was able to travel to the United States. His body was carefully packaged and transported to the Met Brewer Museum in 2018. And since then, he has returned to the University College of London, where he is now on display in the Student Center. Now, returning full circle back to the body world displays within science museums, there were concerns about potential ethical controversies associated with both the procurement of these bodies as well as the display of these bodies. And so there have been ethical reviews associated with it. And I'll tag in the comments below 2 reviews that were done by the California Science Center. First in 2004 and 2005, the second in 2016 and 2017. And they went through and they actually examined the records, the donor records associated with these human remains. And what they say is basically that they provide these recommendations for the ethical display of these cadavers, these remains. They encourage the active involvement and advice of a local ethics committee, engaging the ethics committees to evaluate ethical and cultural concerns prior to booking an exhibition. To exhibit the human bodies or organs without full, free, and informed consent from the living donor is not acceptable. And they therefore verified that the bodies and organs have been donated with specific, full, and informed consent. And then finally, and it's important to recognize, they wanted to really emphasize strongly that these exhibitions need to be in compliance with laws and regulations, in particular when cultural, ethical, and religious controversies can be expected. So this now leads us to this week's ethical dilemma in science. When is it appropriate to display human bodies in public or in private? How do you evaluate the potential research, educational, and entertainment benefits with concerns about respectful treatment of the deceased? What constitutes consent for the display of a body, either in a restricted, private setting or for public exhibition? Should there be a limit to what a person could give their consent for regarding the way in which their body may be used within the future? Please see the description below for additional information and references. Thank you and have a great week.